"You don't belong on that bench, you ghetto fraud detective," Marcus Hale bellowed, before lunging forward and delivering a brutal kick to Judge Elena Washington's abdomen right in the middle of a packed courtroom, the impact echoing like a thunderclap through the stunned silence that followed. But that savage act wasn't just an attack on a respected black judge. It was the fatal mistake that unraveled a web of deception, brutality, and hidden crimes spanning over a decade, crimes that had festered in the shadows of a justice system designed to protect the powerful while crushing the vulnerable. Hale had no clue that the woman he assaulted had been meticulously piecing together a dossier on his dark secrets, including suppressed footage of a cold-blooded killing that shattered lives and protected killers in uniform footage that captured moments of raw terror and betrayal that no official report could ever sanitize. What began as a standard juvenile hearing exploded into a revelation of deep-seated corruption, pulling in federal agents and exposing how the system shielded its most vicious predators, men who wore badges not as symbols of service, but as licenses to dominate and destroy. Stick around to the end, because when this detective tried to bully his way out, the entire structure he relied on came crashing down, forever altering the lives of those who believed terrorizing minority communities was part of the job. A belief rooted in generations of unchecked privilege and prejudice that had poisoned the very foundations of law enforcement in this bustling urban landscape. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in courtroom 5B of the Urban Justice Center, casting a sterile glow on the worn wooden benches and polished oak panels that had absorbed countless pleas for mercy over the years. Panels etched faintly with the ghosts of past verdicts, where families had wept, defendants had trembled, and judges had weighed the scales of fate with varying degrees of impartiality. This particular afternoon promised routine proceedings, but fate had other plans that had been simmering beneath the surface for months as Judge Elena Washington, a 52-year-old veteran of the bench with sharp intellect, honed from 25 years in law, straightened her robe with deliberate poise, her wire-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she scanned the file before her, a file that on the surface appeared mundane, but carried the weight of systemic injustice. It detailed charges against 14-year-old Jamal Carter, a black teen accused of loitering and resisting an officer's commands, vague allegations that smelled of fabrication to her trained eye, allegations couched in the kind of bureaucratic language that masked prejudice, and power plays words like non-compliant and aggressive demeanor that Washington had dissected in dozens of similar cases, recognizing them as tools to criminalize innocence. Jamal sat quietly beside his grandmother, Lydia Carter, his basketball jersey tucked neatly into his jeans, a symbol of the after-school dreams Hale had nearly crushed, dreams of courts, not judicial, but athletic, where talent could lift a boy out of the cycle of suspicion and scrutiny that plagued his neighborhood. Lydia clutched a stack of character references, glowing letters from coaches, praising his discipline on the court, teachers commending his curiosity in class, and neighbors attesting to his helpful nature, like the time he mowed lawns for elderly residents without asking for payment. All evidence of a young life full of potential. Yet here he was, handcuffed by circumstance and color, in a system that too often saw threat where there was only youth. But Hale's reports painted a different picture, one of defiance and threat language Washington had seen too often in cases involving officers like him, officers who patrolled with preconceptions as heavy as their duty belts, turning everyday encounters into battlegrounds. The doors swung open with authority, the brass handles clanging slightly, as if announcing the arrival of inevitability, and in strode Detective Marcus Hale, 6'4" of imposing muscle wrapped in a crisp uniform, his badge gleaming like a shield of invincibility under the harsh lights, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the aisle as he moved, with the deliberate swagger of a man who had never been truly accountable. His steel blue eyes scanned the room with disdain lingering on the spectators, Mostly families from the South Side, their faces etched with weary familiarity of such proceedings, before settling on Jamal with a predatory gleam, a look that spoke volumes of the assumptions he carried, assumptions about worth and danger based on skin tone alone. As he approached the witness stand, his boots echoed like warnings on the tiled floor, each step a reminder of the authority he wielded, an authority that had gone unquestioned for far too long in precincts where oversight was more myth than reality. Washington noted the subtle sneer when his gaze met hers, a flicker of contempt for a black woman wielding power he believed should be his alone. A contempt that simmered just below the surface, fed by years of entitlement and the echo chambers of locker-room banter, where equality was mocked as weakness. Hale settled into the chair legs, spread wide in a display of dominance, his hands resting casually on the armrests, as if this were his domain, not hers, his posture screaming disregard for the protocols that bound others but seemed optional for him. Detective Hale Washington began her tone even, but probing, laced with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her robe through relentless pursuit of truth. Explain the circumstances leading to young Mr. Carter's detention. Hale leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips, his voice carrying the gravelly confidence of unchecked habit. Your Honor, I was patrolling the South Side when I spotted a group of kids hanging around a corner store. Given the area's history with gang activity, I initiated a safety check. He said, the words rolling out smoothly rehearsed, perhaps from countless similar testimonies where such euphemisms had shielded him from scrutiny. Washington's pen scratched notes on her legal pad. Safety check was code for harassment, in her experience, a phrase that justified intrusion without cause, allowing officers to probe and provoke under the guise of prevention, and she had seen the statistics, the disproportionate stops, the escalating encounters that left scars, both physical and emotional, on communities already burdened by inequality. And why single out Jamal? The others scattered. But you pursued him. She continued, her eyes locking onto his, refusing to yield to the intimidation he projected. Hale's eyes narrowed, a vein pulsing faintly in his temple as he shifted slightly, the first crack in his armor appearing. He showed attitude, stared me down, didn't drop his gaze fast enough. That's a red flag for escalation, he replied, his tone sharpening, as if daring her to challenge the logic that equated eye contact with aggression, a logic warped by bias that turned natural human responses into crimes. The courtroom murmured. Even spectators sensed the absurdity. Whispers rippling through the gallery like waves, parents exchanging knowing glances, having lived the reality of such encounters, where compliance was demanded but never enough to guarantee safety. Washington pressed on, revealing patterns she'd uncovered in late-night reviews of case files, patterns that painted Hale as a serial offender against fairness. His arrests overwhelmingly targeted black and brown youth, with similar phrasing in every report: defiant posture, failure to show respect, phrases that criminalized adolescents while absolving the adult wielding the power. As questions mounted, probing deeper into his methods, his history, the discrepancies in his narratives, Hale's facade cracked further, his responses growing curt, defensive, laced with undercurrents of resentment that bubbled closer to the surface with each inquiry. Washington produced initial reports from past cases, holding them up for the court to see, showing alterations that turned questionable stops into justified actions, handwritten notes scrubbed clean in final versions, timestamps that didn't align witness accounts buried or dismissed. One file stood out like a beacon of horror. The death of 17-year-old Tyrone Ellis ruled a defensive shooting, but riddled with inconsistencies. Hale had claimed Tyrone reached for a gun during a routine stop, but witness statements Washington had gathered privately through discreet channels from community advocates and reluctant insiders suggested otherwise, painting a picture of a terrified teen complying until fear made him flinch. A flinch misinterpreted, or perhaps deliberately misconstrued as threat. Tension built like a storm gathering force, the air in the courtroom thickening with anticipation, every eye fixed on the exchange, the bailiffs shifting uneasily as Hale's composure frayed his fists, clenching on the stand, his breathing audible, now ragged. Hale's voice rose, cutting through the hush. "You think you know the streets from up there? These kids are future criminals, and I'm the one keeping order." The words exploding out, laced with venom, revealing the core of his worldview, one where presumption of guilt was default for those who looked like Jamal or Tyrone. Washington remained composed, her face a mask of steady resolve, refusing to be baited. Her voice calm as she countered, "Detective, your records show a bias that's unconstitutional, a pattern of targeting that undermines the very justice you claim to uphold." Each word measured, building the case brick by brick, exposing the rot. Hale's face reddened, veins bulging on his neck, his eyes wild now, the predator cornered and lashing out. In a flash of rage, he exploded from the stand, his massive frame propelling him forward with terrifying speed, his boot swinging in a vicious arc that connected with Washington's midsection in a brutal kick, the force sending her reeling back into her chair, pain blooming sharp and hot, but her eyes never wavering, her dignity intact even as gasps and screams filled the room. Chaos erupted, bailiffs rushed in from all sides, tackling Hale as he stood there chest heaving, a twisted grin of momentary triumph fading as reality crashed in the courtroom, descending into pandemonium, with shouts for order calls for medical aid spectators rising in outrage. But amidst it all, Washington straightened slowly, her hand pressing against the injury, knowing that Hale's assault had just ignited his downfall, a spark that would consume the empire of lies he had built, forever changing the trajectory of justice in this city and beyond, as federal whispers already in motion prepared to descend, turning one man's act of violence into the catalyst for systemic reckoning. The immediate aftermath was a blur of activity, with court officers restraining Hale, his struggles futile against the surge of authority now turned against him, his bellows of defiance drowned out by the clamor while paramedics attended to Washington, her poise unbroken, as she waved off concerns insisting the proceedings continue in spirit, if not in session, her mind already racing ahead to the evidence she had safeguarded, the files locked in her chambers that detailed Hale's reign of terror, from altered videos to coerced witnesses, a dossier compiled over sleepless nights, driven by a sense of duty that transcended personal risk. Jamal watched wide-eyed his grandmother, pulling him close, whispering assurances even as tears streamed down her face. The boy's innocence vindicated in that moment of exposure, though the scars of the experience would linger, shaping his future in ways yet unseen. The gallery buzzed with a mix of horror and vindication, cell phones capturing the scene despite prohibitions footage that would soon viralize, amplifying the call for accountability, drawing eyes from across the nation to this single courtroom where the veil had been torn. Hale, now handcuffed and led away, snarled obscenities, his invincibility shattered, unaware that this was merely the opening act in his destruction, that the kick meant to assert dominance had instead sealed his fate, inviting the full weight of federal scrutiny upon him and his enablers. Washington, as the room cleared, allowed herself a moment of reflection, the pain in her side a reminder of the cost, but also of the resilience required to confront evil embedded in institutions, her resolve hardening like steel, ready for the battles to come, knowing that justice, though delayed, was now inexorably in motion. The Urban Justice Center, typically a place of quiet bureaucracy, transformed that day into a battleground of revelation, where one judge's persistence met one detective's hubris, sparking a fire that would burn through layers of corruption, illuminating the dark corners where prejudice thrived unchecked. In the hours that followed, as news crews gathered outside interviewing witnesses who spoke of the shock and the long-overdue exposure, Washington's name began to circulate as a symbol of courage, a black woman who had stared down the beast and refused to blink her actions, inspiring whispers of change in communities long silenced. Hale, in a holding cell, paced furiously, his mind reeling from the turn of events, replaying the moment his temper betrayed him, little knowing that the dossier Washington had assembled included not just his past sins, but connections to a wider network, bribes from private interests, manipulated statistics to inflate his record. All threads that federal agents were already pulling, unraveling the tapestry of his career. Jamal and Lydia left the courthouse under protective escort. The boys' charges informally dropped in the chaos, but the experience etching a new awareness into his young mind, a determination to rise above the labels imposed upon him. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 5B dimmed as maintenance crews cleaned the scuff marks from Hale's outburst, but the echoes of that day lingered, a turning point where individual defiance met institutional inertia, setting the stage for a reckoning that would reshape lives, policies, and perceptions for generations to come, proving that even in the face of violence, truth could prevail when wielded with unyielding grace. Gasps filled the air as Judge Elena Washington clutched her side pain, shooting through her like a lightning bolt that momentarily blurred her vision. But her resolve remained unbroken, a fortress of determination, forged from years of navigating a system rife with inequities. And in that instant, Detective Marcus Hale stood defiant, his chest heaving with the ragged breaths of a man who had just crossed an irrevocable line, unaware that federal eyes had been watching from the shadows, eyes belonging to agents who had long suspected the rot in his precinct, but needed this very spark to ignite their operation. This wasn't isolated fury erupting in a moment of weakness. It was the culmination of years where Hale and his allies had manipulated the system to enforce terror on minority neighborhoods, turning badges into instruments of intimidation and streets into zones of arbitrary control. But now, with the assault broadcast live via courtroom cameras that captured every damning angle, the floodgates opened wide, unleashing a torrent of scrutiny that would drown the conspirators in their own deceptions. Federal investigators, tipped off by Washington's discreet inquiries months earlier, inquiries born from whispers of whistleblowers and anomalies in case logs that she had pursued with the tenacity of a scholar, uncovering ancient truths swooped in like shadows, materializing into form. Arresting Hale on the spot for assaulting a judicial officer, a federal offense that carried the weight of decades behind bars, their badges flashing under the courtroom lights as they read him his rights, his struggles against the cuffs only amplifying the spectacle. What followed was a cascade of revelations that peeled back layers of corruption like skin from an onion, each layer more pungent and eye-watering than the last doctored evidence that had been systematically altered to justify brutality. Bribe networks funneled through shell companies that rewarded officers for inflating arrest numbers, and a brotherhood of uniforms who viewed black lives as expendable collateral in their self-proclaimed war on crime, a war that enriched them while devastating communities. In the hours after the incident, Agent Carla Ruiz from the FBI's corruption unit took charge with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of justice. Her team, comprised of analysts poring over digital trails and field operatives executing synchronized raids, had been shadowing Hale for months based on anonymous leaks about his precinct's irregularities. Leaks that originated from a disillusioned rookie who had seen one too many cover-ups and decided anonymity was the price of conscience. Ruiz, a no-nonsense Latina with a track record of dismantling rogue units across state lines, her sharp features etched with the lines of countless late nights coordinated raids on Hale's modest but suspiciously upgraded home, his cluttered office desk laden with forgotten coffee mugs and incriminating memos, and the dimly lit stations of his superiors, where filing cabinets held secrets more volatile than dynamite. Computers seized during these operations, their hard drives whirring to a halt as agents unplugged them mid-process, revealed encrypted emails outlining a scheme as intricate as a spider's web. Officers inflated arrest quotas for promotions, and bonuses targeting vulnerable teens like Jamal to pad stats and secure kickbacks from private prisons, that profited handsomely from juvenile detention facilities where profit margins soared with every filled bed turning human misery into shareholder dividends. One bombshell exploded in the form of a hidden server log buried deep in the precinct's IT infrastructure, like a digital time capsule of wrongdoing, showing Hale-altering body cam footage with software tools that allowed frame-by-frame manipulation, erasing moments of compliance and inserting fabricated threats. In Tyrone Ellis's case, the original video depicted the teen surrendering with hands raised high, his voice cracking as he pleaded for mercy after a mistaken identity stop that stemmed from Hale's snap judgment based on nothing more than a hoodie and skin color, but Hale's edited version inserted threatening movements and audio overlays suggesting aggression, justifying the fatal shots that rang out like accusations against the night sky. Audio from precinct meetings captured on a whistleblower's hidden recorder, disguised as a pen in a sea of notepads, surfaced with chilling clarity. Hale boasting to Captain Derek Voss in a smoke-filled break room that Ellis boy needed a lesson strutting like he owned the block, thinking he could question my stop without consequences. We cleaned it up nice, didn't we, with the report tweaks and witness coaching. Voss, a grizzled veteran with a mustache that hid his perpetual sneer, laughed heartily. Paperwork's an art form. Marcus added a dash of perceived threat, and it keeps the activists off our backs, plus those overtime checks from the higher-ups don't hurt. The conspiracy deepened with each uncovered thread, financial trails leading like breadcrumbs to off-the-books payments, from lobbyists pushing for tougher sentencing laws that filled coffers while emptying neighborhoods of their youth. Hale receiving envelopes stuffed with cash for community control, a euphemism for intimidating families who dared complain of tactics that included late-night drive-bys with sirens blaring or anonymous calls threatening child services intervention. Jamal's grandmother, Lydia, had faced such anonymous threats after questioning prior arrests in the family, now linked to Hale's cronies through phone records that agents cross-referenced with burner numbers, revealing a pattern of harassment designed to silence dissent and maintain the facade of untouchability. Ruiz's interrogations cracked weaker links in the chain, a rookie officer named Sanchez Sweat, beading on his brow under the harsh interrogation room lights, confessing to planting evidence on command during stops. Fearing retaliation from the Brotherhood that promised protection but delivered only complicity in evil. His voice trembling as he detailed how Hale mentored him with twisted lessons. Plant the baggie. If they mouth off, it's for the greater good, keeps the stats up and the bonuses flowing. As news of the raids and arrests spread like wildfire through social media feeds and evening broadcasts, community outrage boiled over into organized protests outside the Justice Center, crowds swelling with signs demanding "End the Blue Wall" and "Justice for Tyrone." Jamal's case becoming a rallying cry, a symbol of the innocents routinely sacrificed on the altar of quotas and prejudice. Washington, recovering in her chambers with an ice pack pressed to her bruised ribs, provided key testimony via secure video link to Ruiz's team, detailing how she'd built her file from whistleblower tips, slipped under her door in plain envelopes, and data anomalies spotted in public records. Requests that she pursued relentlessly, her voice steady, despite the pain outlining patterns of racial disparity in arrests that statistics alone couldn't capture the human cost in broken families and lost futures. The probe expanded like roots, seeking water, implicating prosecutors who dismissed complaints as unfounded after receiving golf outing invitations from precinct captains, their emails revealing quid pro quo arrangements where cases were buried in exchange for favorable endorsements during election cycles. Hale in custody at a federal holding facility where the walls seemed to close in with each passing hour, ranted about a setup by those who hate real cops. His words recorded for psychological evaluation only fueling the case against him, as they revealed a mindset steeped in entitlement and denial. His family, a wife who had long suspected but ignored the late nights and unexplained cash, distancing themselves with public statements of shock assets frozen by court order, leaving him stripped of the luxuries his corruption had afforded. But this was just the storm's eye, a momentary calm before deeper horrors awaited, as victims' stories poured in through hotlines set up by community organizations. Tales of midnight raids, fabricated charges, and lives derailed by Hale's whims, painting him not as a lone wolf howling in isolation, but as the snarling face of a poisoned institution, where loyalty to the badge meant betrayal of the oath to serve and protect an institution now facing the scalpel of reform. The media frenzy intensified, reporters camping outside Ruiz's command center, a makeshift war room in a downtown office building where whiteboards mapped connections like a conspiracy theorist's dream linking Hale to Voss, and beyond to City Hall figures who had turned blind eyes for campaign contributions. The revelations dominating headlines and talk shows sparking national conversations on policing and race that echoed in living rooms and boardrooms alike. Community leaders, long voices in the wilderness, found amplification organizing town halls where survivors shared their scars, emotional and physical, fostering a groundswell of support for oversight bills that gained traction in legislative chambers, bills mandating independent reviews of every use-of-force incident and body cam audits conducted by civilian panels. Ruiz's team uncovered more digital gold mines, like a private chat group on an encrypted app where officers traded tips on handling problem kids, code for escalating encounters to justify force. Hale's messages standing out with their vitriol: if they don't bow quick, remind them who's in charge. A little shove sets the tone, followed by laughing emojis that belied the terror they inflicted. Financial auditors brought in as consultants traced wire transfers to offshore accounts, small sums adding up to fortunes siphoned from overtime fraud, and seized assets that never made it to evidence lockers. Hale's cut funding vacations and a boat docked in a marina under a false name, luxuries, now seized as proceeds of crime. As the net tightened, plea deals trickled in from peripheral figures, a sergeant offering testimony on Voss's direct orders to shred complaints, his cooperation earning reduced charges but eternal ostracism from the force he once called family. Washington's role evolved from victim to vanguard, her statements guiding the investigation's direction, pointing to overlooked files in county archives that corroborated patterns of abuse stretching back a decade, her insight invaluable in decoding the jargon of corruption. The South Side neighborhoods once patrolled with fear as the norm began to breathe easier, as Hale's acolytes were suspended pending charges. Interim officers trained in de-escalation, stepping in with community liaisons to rebuild trust brick by brick. Yet, amidst the progress, Ruiz faced pushback from union lawyers filing motions to suppress evidence claiming chain of custody violations. Battles fought in preliminary hearings where the air crackled with tension, but the weight of digital proof, unalterable timestamps, and metadata proved insurmountable. Hale's psychological profile, compiled by experts, painted a portrait of narcissism, fueled by unaddressed biases, recommending no bail due to flight risk. His isolation in custody, a preview of the life sentence looming. The unraveling extended to policy overhauls, with the department's chief resigning. Amid scandal, a reformer appointed in his stead, promising transparency that skeptics viewed warily but hoped would endure. Victims like Tyrone's family found solace in civil suits, advancing settlements pending that could fund scholarships, in his name turning tragedy into legacy. As days turned to weeks, the conspiracy's full scope emerged not as isolated incidents, but a symbiotic ecosystem where power protected power, but now cracked open by one judge's courage and one agent's diligence. It bled out its secrets, paving the way for a dawn where justice might finally illuminate the shadows. With Hale in federal lockup, his once imposing frame reduced to a jumpsuit-clad shadow shuffling through sterile corridors under the watchful eyes of guards, who viewed him as just another inmate number. The trials began a spectacle of accountability that riveted the nation like a gripping serial drama unfolding in real time. each session packed with journalists scribbling furiously, cameras capturing every twitch and testimony, and public galleries filled with a diverse crowd representing the spectrum of hope and skepticism that such high-profile cases invariably inspire. But this was no mere show. It was justice served with surgical precision, dissecting the anatomy of corruption one incriminating detail at a time. Prosecutors led by a formidable team from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division painted a vivid picture through opening statements that echoed like indictments against an entire era of unchecked policing. Hale, as the architect of a regime where fear masqueraded as law enforcement, his methods not aberrations but blueprints replicated across precincts, influencing rookies who idolized his tough guy persona without grasping the human wreckage left in its wake, wreckage that included shattered families, eroded trust, and a generation of youth scarred by encounters that turned protectors into predators. Witnesses streamed in like a procession of truth-tellers, long silenced from traumatized families who had buried their grief under layers of resignation, to reformed insiders who had flipped for leniency, their voices cracking under the weight of revelations that exposed not just Hale's sins, but the enabling culture that nurtured them. Tyrone's sister, Maya Ellis, testified tearfully about her brother's aspirations. He'd been accepted to a prestigious engineering program at a state university, sketching blueprints for bridges in his notebook during breaks from his part-time job at a local hardware store. Dreams of building connections in a divided world cruelly severed by Hale's bullets. Her words painting a portrait of lost potential that brought jurors to the edge of tears, humanizing the statistics that prosecutors projected on courtroom screens, showing disproportionate impacts on minority communities. Digital forensics experts, bespectacled specialists wielding laptops like weapons, demonstrated with clickable demos how Hale's network had employed sophisticated AI tools to fabricate reports. Algorithms trained on biased datasets that auto-generated phrases like imminent threat based on racial profiling, inputs tools sourced from shady vendors who marketed them as efficiency enhancers, but functioned as veils for discrimination, their testimony backed by code snippets displayed on overhead projectors that elicited nods from tech-savvy jurors and gasps from others realizing the dystopian underbelly of modern policing. Hale's defense, mounted by a high-powered attorney known for defending controversial figures with bombastic flair, crumbled under the relentless cross-examination. The lawyer's attempts to portray Hale as a stressed hero, buckling when confronted with his client's own recorded rants from wiretaps. Hale taking the stand in an ill-fitting suit that couldn't hide his diminished stature, spewing justifications, with a voice hoarse from isolation. I kept the peace in chaos, made split-second calls that saved lives. But the playback of his precinct tirades, where he mocked uppity communities with slurs that drew objections overruled by the judge, sealed his fate like a self-inflicted wound. The jury's faces hardening as they heard him dismiss victims as collateral in the real-world, words that echoed hollowly in the wood-paneled chamber. The jury deliberated briefly, the tension palpable in the courthouse hallways, where supporters gathered with signs and chants emerging with verdicts that rang out like gavel strikes: guilty on murder in the first degree, for Tyrone's death conspiracy to deprive civil rights, for the network of harassment and aggravated assault, for the courtroom kick that had become emblematic of his contempt for the very system he swore to uphold. The four-person's voice, steady as convictions piled up like dominoes falling in slow motion. Sentencing was merciless. The judge, a stern figure with a reputation for fairness, delivering a monologue that dissected Hale's lack of remorse, noting how his assault on Washington demonstrated an absolute rejection of the rule of law and constitutional government, imposing life without parole for the murder, plus consecutive decades for the assault and conspiracy, a term that would see Hale age into obscurity. Behind bars, his appeals doomed by the mountain of evidence that left no loophole unplugged. Voss and his cohorts followed in subsequent trials, a parade of fallen brass where Captain Derek Voss received 40 years for masterminding the cover-ups his once commanding presence wilted as he begged for mercy, citing family hardships only to be rebuked with reminders of the families he had helped destroy. Lieutenant Hayes, the sneering enabler, drew 25 years for witness intimidation and evidence tampering his plea deal, rejected when fresh tapes surfaced of him pressuring subordinates. Other officers faced varying fates, some turning state's evidence for reduced sentences of 10, 15 years, their testimonies unraveling further threads, while a few holdouts were slapped with maximums their unions powerless against the federal tied pensions revoked and names stricken from honor rolls, transforming them from community guardians to cautionary tales in training manuals. Reform swept in like a cleansing tide, washing away the old guard stains, with policies born from task forces comprising community leaders, academics, and reformed officers, the Justice Center implementing mandatory de-escalation training modules that simulated real-world scenarios with VR headsets, emphasizing empathy over force community advisory boards, empowered to oversee arrest patterns and review body cam footage quarterly, preventing the technical glitches that had shielded abusers, and tech audits conducted by independent firms using blockchain to ensure report integrity, making alterations as detectable as fingerprints on glass. Jamal cleared of all charges with an official apology from the city that included a scholarship fund in his name, channeled his ordeal into advocacy, founding a youth empowerment group called Voices Unsilenced that taught legal rights through workshops in school gyms and online forums. His story inspiring peers to document encounters with apps designed for real-time uploads to secure servers, turning potential victims into empowered citizens who viewed the law as an ally rather than adversary. Washington returned to the bench stronger. Her bruise faded, but her influence amplified, mentoring a new generation of judges through national seminars on identifying systemic biases in case dockets. Her chambers becoming a hub for aspiring clerks from underrepresented backgrounds, sharing strategies on building airtight evidence files without compromising ethics. Her assault scar, a subtle reminder during speeches where she emphasized resilience as the ultimate judicial tool, earning her awards from civil rights organizations that celebrated her as a beacon in turbulent times. Years on, the legacy endures as a multifaceted tapestry woven from threads of tragedy and triumph, memorials sprouting in parks once patrolled by Hale's fear tactics, like the Tyrone Ellis Innovation Center, a community hub offering STEM classes and counseling funded by settlements from the city that acknowledged wrongs without hedging, spaces where healing occurs through shared stories around circles of folding chairs, laughter mixing with tears as survivors reclaim narratives stolen by violence. Hale rots in a maximum security wing, his days a monotonous grind of meals slid through slots and recreation yards where he avoids eye contact with inmates who know his story from news clips, a cautionary tale echoed in police academies nationwide through mandatory modules titled The Cost of Corruption, featuring anonymized case studies that dissect his downfall to prevent replication, instructors stressing that integrity isn't optional but foundational. Communities thrive without the shadow of arbitrary terror, youth programs flourishing with mentorship from officers vetted through rigorous background checks, crime rates dipping, not from intimidation, but genuine partnerships where cops coach little league teams and attend block parties, fostering bonds that Hale's era had severed. Washington's final reflection, shared in a best-selling memoir that topped charts and sparked book clubs in suburbs and inner cities alike, encapsulated the transformation. One act of defiance exposed the rot that had festered unseen. Collective courage rebuilt the foundation from the ground up, proving that justice isn't a destination, but a journey. We all must walk together. Her words resonating in TED Talks and podcasts, inspiring policy wonks and everyday activists to push for federal standards on policing that gained bipartisan support in legislatures wary of repeating history. The ripple effects extended globally, with international human rights groups citing the case in reports on institutional reform delegations from abroad visiting the revamped precincts to study models of accountability that balanced authority with humanity, exporting lessons learned from Riverside's reckoning to places grappling with similar demons. Victims' families, once isolated in grief, formed networks of support annual gatherings at the memorial sites where candles flicker against evening skies. Stories exchanged like heirlooms, passing resilience to younger generations who grow up knowing their worth isn't defined by badges or biases. Jamail, now a college student majoring in social justice, speaks at commencements about turning pain into purpose. His group expanding to chapters in multiple states, partnering with tech firms to develop AI that detects bias in reports, rather than perpetuating it, a poetic inversion of the tools that once aided Hale. Ruiz, promoted for her role, heads a national task force monitoring hotspots of corruption, her methods a blend of data-driven precision and community engagement that prevents outbreaks before they fester, her name synonymous with integrity in FBI lore. The courthouse itself transformed murals depicting diverse figures in pursuit of equity adorning walls, once bare educational tours for school groups emphasizing the building's role in pivotal change guides, recounting the kick that echoed as a wake-up call without glorifying the violence. Hale's few remaining supporters, fringe voices on obscure forums, fade into irrelevance as public opinion solidifies against the old ways, polls showing overwhelming support for reforms that prioritize de-escalation and diversity in ranks. In quiet moments, Washington visits the memorials tracing names etched in stone, reflecting on how one courtroom clash cascaded into a movement that redefined power, her legacy, not in verdicts rendered but lives uplifted, a testament that endurance in the face of adversity can bend the arc of history toward light. The story closes not with finality, but ongoing vigilance, communities empowered to hold mirrors to authority, ensuring that Hale's downfall isn't an endpoint, but a milestone in the perpetual quest for equity, where every citizen's voice contributes to the chorus, demanding better, proving that from the ashes of corruption, societies can rise renewed, resilient, and resolute.